Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one we have several developments in favor of the Russians. The Russians have been ongoing with a massive offensive over the past few days, where every single day we see several advances by the Russians, and this is a result of a renewed offensive based on the rotation of Russian forces. So fresh units have been sent in. And currently the Russians have taken advantage of the breaches that they have made along the front line in the Donetsk region. Therefore, the current operations of the Russians is to poke along the front line to identify a new weak point and take advantage of that. The Ukrainians have recently relocated their own forces along the front line in an attempt to cover every single part. This, however, means that they are unable to concentrate a large forces in one area, and that means that if the Russians concentrate their own forces in one area, they will be able to make a breakthrough, whether it is in the Donetsk region, Zaporizhia region, Luhansk region, Kharkiv region, or the Kursk region. We see heavy fighting in every single one of these areas. The objective of the Russians is twofold: to grind down the Ukrainian armed forces and to locate and exploit gaps in Ukraine's defenses. Starting out with the frontline changes we see in the direction of Volodar, fighting continues over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northwest of the settlement. Following the capture of Volodar, there has been no significant territorial changes in favor of the Russians, and this is due to the fact that many of the units involved were sent to spread out the front line to fight near Solotaneva, west of Remersky Ledge in the direction of Levatne, and in the northern direction towards Antonivka and Katerinivka. So the Russians are spreading their forces out to hit every single part of this front line. This forces the Ukrainians to similarly spread out their forces as well. And this will give the Russians an opportunity, if they detect a weakness in the Ukrainian defenses, to concentrate their forces in that direction and attempt a breakthrough. We see here in the direction of Maximilianivka, following the capture of the settlements, the Russians have moved to the high ground along the highway in between Marinka and Kurahove, and here they've managed to capture a large section of it, securing their positions in Maximilianivka by controlling the high ground positions along the highway, which will allow the Russians to then push on to the next fortified positions of the Ukrainians southwest of Maximilianivka. This will allow the Russians to have full control over the eastern parts of Kurahove. It will also cut off the connection between Kurahove and the fortified positions of the Ukrainians further east, which will allow the Russians to flank these fortified positions, forcing the Ukrainians to withdraw from them or to be encircled. And this will allow the Russians to slowly capture the fortified positions here in the eastern parts and then push towards Antonivka and Katerinivka with a strengthened position from the northern and eastern directions. The Russian advance here towards the highway was confirmed with this geolocated footage. Now we see that the Russians have managed to advance here in the southern section of the Donetsk region. We also see fighting in the direction of Sakharina, but the Russians continue towards the outskirts of the settlement. The Ukrainians have several positions along the fortified positions here northwest of Sakharina, as well as the general area in the western parts of it. This has prevented the Russians from launching further operations in the southern direction, as they have to secure their flank first. Combining that with the assaults that the Russians have been doing in the northern direction in the southern flank of Selidove, it is clear that the Russians are focusing on the western flank first and foremost to completely secure the road in and out of Selidove in the southern direction before moving on towards Kremenebelka. This makes a lot of sense considering the concentration of Ukrainian forces in the direction of Selidove, where the Ukrainians have sent 4 brigades to defend the settlement, including elite brigades, and this makes it a priority target, where in the southern direction there are just 2 brigades spread across the entire section. That isn't a large concentration of forces, and it is only a secondary objective for the Russians. Moving up further north in the direction of Terny and the Serbets River line, the Russians have made a small advance here in the east of Novosedove. The Russians are doing continuous positional fighting in this direction to slowly capture the positions of the Ukrainians east of these settlements and develop offensive operations towards these settlements along the Serbets River line, similar to what we've seen further north in the direction of Nevsky and Makiivka. The offensive operations are slowly developing to capture the eastern bank of the Serbets River line, to then slowly initiate into a battle over Tursk and Sarishne east of Liman, and then towards Liman itself. Further north in direction of the Usk River line, the Russians have advanced further within Krylyakivka. Although the deep state map claims that they've kicked out the Russian forces, this geolocated footage confirms that the Russians have gone deeper into Krylyakivka, and there is two sets of geolocated footage confirming the Russian full control over the strait here in the northern parts of Krylyakivka, and then a push deeper inside. This indicates that the Russians are advancing in all three directions in the central parts of the settlement, attempting to expand their foothold as much as possible to then develop offensive operations further within the settlement, to cut off the connection with Sinkove on the other side of the river line. This will limit the Ukrainian ability to connect the northern and southern parts in the eastern and western parts of the Usk River line and the Peshana River line, and this will put a hindrance to the Ukrainian defensive capabilities. What exactly would the effects be if the Russians cut off the connection? The effects would be that currently the Ukrainians are able to quickly redirect their forces between the northern and southern parts in case the Russians concentrate their forces in one area for a push. However, if this connection is cut, then the road becomes much longer for relocation of forces, and this will limit the Ukrainian capabilities to defend against a Russian concentration of forces. It also allowed Russians to quickly redirect their forces. If the Ukrainians redirect their forces in the northern parts because they expect a Russian offensive, the Russians can simply go in the southern direction as they have a direct connection, and again, Ukraine will be constantly on the move, having to redirect their forces through a longer road, and that becomes to the detriment of the Ukrainian forces. So it will not change the front line significantly, but it will allow the Russians to maneuver at a much faster pace, which gives them a larger advantage in terms of the ability to quickly launch offensive operations, taking advantage of a weak Ukrainian resistance. In the Kursk region, we see several developments here. The Russians have managed to recapture the settlement of Ruskaya Konopelke, and we have also seen that they've managed to capture some forest lands here west of the settlement, and this is based on this geolocated footage of this development. At the same time, we see that the Russians have pushed towards Viktorovka with the geolocated footage as well, and the Russians have managed to recapture Tulsi Lug, which means that the pocket has now been closed. Based on this, we see that the Russian focus is, rather than going directly towards Sutsha, is to push in the direction of Malayat Lugnia, where the objective is to combine the assaults from the northern and western parts to cut off this next pocket here in the northern direction. This will allow the Russians to secure a large portion of the northwestern parts of the Kursk incursion of the Ukrainians, to then push in the direction of Sutsha from the northern and western parts. This will allow the Russians to do a combined strike on the supply lines in and out of Sutsha. Combined with the recent developments on the eastern parts of Sutsha as well, it is likely that the Russians will attack from both the eastern and western directions. The Khovo has been cut off for a long time now, so that also means it is likely that the Russians will recapture that soon. That will allow the Russians to do incursions, either with DRGs or a river crossing, towards the flank of Sutsha in the southern direction. So there are several possibilities for the Russians to launch a combined effort offensive towards Sutsha from the eastern, southern, western, and northern directions, from every single direction, and the Ukrainian forces out in the front line would be in a vulnerable position. The recently rotated 17th Tank Brigade and the 47th Mechanized Brigade have both been sent to the northwestern direction, so these developments point towards the Ukrainians being in a very difficult position, and that newly rotated forces are already sent to the heat of battle and are facing difficulties with the Russian offensive so far being too much for them to handle. The Ukrainians have also largely moved from using brigades to using battalions. This means that although the 47th Mechanized Brigade and the 17th Tank Brigade have been sent to the Kursk region, it is likely just elements of these brigades, whether it is one or two tank battalions or mechanized battalions, these are simply not strong enough forces to deal with the Russian offensive. While the Russians are working at division level currently, that means that the current offensive operations of the Russians here in the Kursk direction consists of units of the 144th Motorized Rifle Division, but they also make use of separate brigades and regiments, which are smaller units around the size of 4,000 soldiers, who act independently from divisions, such as the 810th Marine Brigade. So we see that there are several units of the Russians in this direction. The Russian and Ukrainian manpower comparison is about even here in the Kursk region. Although there were claims that the Russians have 50,000 soldiers, that is simply bogus and it's not true. The power balance in the Kursk region is somewhere around even, but the Russians simply are making use of heavy artillery and firepower advantages that they have, and this has allowed them to successfully launch these maneuver operations, which cut off Ukrainian positions, and something that the Russians have done in a better way than what the Ukrainians did during the Kursk incursion is that the Russians are making use of a more controlled approach towards the Ukrainian lines, while the Ukrainian objective was to meet with a Russian defensive position and then bypass it, leaving a small contingent of forces to bog down the Russian forces and then go beyond it, which allowed them to capture larger swaths of territories in a shorter time frame. It also meant that their positions were not really that powerful and they had to do a lot of fighting to actually secure these positions. The Russians instead are slowly approaching, cutting off Ukrainian forces, slowly grinding down those Ukrainian forces, capturing the settlements before moving on to the next objective, where the objective is to continue this bit by bit, encircling Ukrainian positions all across the front line, first in Lyubimovka and Tolchiluk, now in the direction northwest of the Kursk incursion, and they're likely launching a separate operation in the direction of Marcianovka if they capture Bondarivka and the eastern outskirts of Sutsha. They will not directly storm Marcianovka, but instead attack its flanks in an attempt to encircle those. There's also potential of a push through Svetlikovo towards Gorgolevka and a river crossing in the south. There are several operations that the Russians have as opportunities to launch operations to cut off Ukrainian forces, but they are slowly taking the safest options for largest possible gain with the lowest possible risk. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.